student at Oakland University, and I am studying elementary education, and one of my classes I was supposed to go into a elementary school classroom and read them a book, but unfortunately due to the coronavirus I was unable to do that because of school shutting down. But thanks to the help of technology, I am still able to record a video of me reading a story, and the story that I chose to read today is called Ruby the Copycat, and it is by Peggy Rathman, and it is also illustrated by Peggy Rathman, and it is a blue ribbon book, and this was one of my favorite books when I was a kid. I remember reading it a bunch and just loving it. And it is a story about a young girl named Ruby, who is probably around the same age as everyone watching this, and she is a new student. And being a new student can be very difficult and intimidating, and I'm sure many people can relate to what it feels like to be a new student or just going to a different school. And Ruby meets a student named Angela, who we can see on the cover. And she begins to really admire Angela, but she kind of takes her admiration for Angela to the next level. So that is what this story is about. And as you can see on the cover of this book, it actually gives us some clues about how Ruby copies Angela. You can kind of see that Angela is wearing a purple sweater with white flowers, and then you can see how Ruby recreated her own version of Angela's sweater. And that just kind of gives us a clue of what this story is going to be about. So I'm going to get started reading it, and I think I'll read the page first and then show the picture just so it's easier for me to read and for you guys to see the full illustration. Okay, so it is for Grammy, Joy, and Papa George, who always try to set a good example. Monday was Ruby's first day in Miss Hart's class. "Class, this is Ruby," announced Mrs. Hart. "Ruby, you may use the empty desk behind Angela. Angela is the girl with the pretty red bow in her hair." Angela smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Angela's bow and tiptoed to her seat. Here is the picture. So what are some things that, just by looking at the way Ruby is standing, what are some things that we can tell about how she's feeling? We can kind of see that she looks kind of shy and nervous just by the way she's standing behind the door. Her head is kind of tilted down. It looks like her arms are behind her body, so it looks like she's kind of scared to enter this room of students that she doesn't know, which I'm sure many people would be nervous about doing. "I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend," said Miss Hart. "Does anyone have something to share?" "I was the flower girl at my sister's wedding," said Angela. "That's exciting," said Miss Hart. Ruby raised her hand halfway. "I was the flower girl at my sister's wedding, too." "What a coincidence," said Miss Hart. Angela turned and smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at the top of Angela's head. "Class, please take out your reading books," said Mrs. Hart. Here's the picture. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped all the way home on one foot. When Ruby came back to school, she was wearing a red bow in her hair. She slid into her seat behind Angela. "I like your bow," whispered Angela. "I like yours too," whispered Ruby. "Class, please take out your math books," said Miss Hart. On Tuesday morning, Angela wore a sweater with daisies on it. At lunchtime, Ruby hopped home sideways. When Ruby came back to school after lunch, she was wearing a sweater with daisies on it. "I like your sweater," whispered Angela. "I like yours too," whispered Ruby. On Wednesday, Angela wore a hand-painted t-shirt with matching sneakers. After lunch, Ruby hopped back to school wearing a hand-painted t-shirt with matching sneakers. "Why are you sitting like that?" whispered Angela. "Wet paint," said Ruby. On Thursday morning, during sharing time, Angela modeled the flower girl dress she wore at her sister's wedding. Ruby modeled her flower girl dress too, right after lunch. Angela didn't whisper anything. So what do you think Angela is feeling right now? Just by looking at her, it kind of looks like she's a little annoyed because she's not really looking at Ruby. And this time, something different happened. She didn't whisper back to Ruby that she liked her dress. She didn't say anything. By coincidence, on Friday morning, both girls wore red and lavender striped dresses. At lunchtime, Angela raced home. When Angela came back to school, she was wearing black. So what do we think Angela is feeling now? I think that she's very annoyed with Ruby and she wants her to stop copying her because she changed her outfit after she saw that Ruby was wearing the same thing once again. On Friday afternoon, Miss Hart asked everyone to write a short poem. "Who would like to read first?" asked Miss Hart. Angela raised her hand. She stood by her desk and read, "I had a cat I could not see, because it stayed in back of me. It was a very loyal pet. It's sad we never really met." "That was very good," said Miss Hart. "Now who's next?" Miss Hart looked around the room. "Ruby?" Ruby stood and recited slowly. "I had a nice pet, who I never met, because it always stayed behind me, and I'm sure it was a cat too." Ruby smiled at the back of Angela's head. Someone whispered. Ruby sat down. "What a coincidence," murmured Miss Hart. Angela scribbled something on a piece of paper. She passed it to Ruby. The note said, "You copied me. I'm telling Miss Hart. P.S. I hate your hair that way." Ruby buried her chin in the collar of her blouse. A big tear rolled down her nose and plopped onto the note. When the bell rang, Miss Hart sent everyone home except Ruby. So as you can see, it looks like Ruby's crying after receiving that note. What do you think? How do you think that note made Ruby feel? Looks like she's really upset and taken off guard. Miss Hart closed the door of the schoolroom and sat on the edge of Ruby's desk. "Ruby, dear," she said gently, "you don't need to copy everything Angela does. You can be anything you want to be. But be Ruby first. I like Ruby." Miss Hart smiled at Ruby. Ruby smiled at Miss Hart's beautiful, polished fingernails. "Have a nice weekend," said Miss Hart. "Have a nice weekend," said Ruby. So what do we think is going to happen next? She's looking at her teacher's red nails. What do we think she's going to come to school after the weekend with? On Monday morning, Miss Hart said, "I hope everyone had a pleasant weekend. I did. I went to the opera." Miss Hart looked around the room. "Does anyone have something to share?" Ruby waved her hand. Glued to every finger was a pink plastic fingernail. "I went to the opera too," said Ruby. "She did not," whispered Angela. Miss Hart folded her hands and looked very serious. "Ruby, dear," said Miss Hart gently, "did you do anything else this weekend?" So it looks like she found a new person to copy instead of Angela. Ruby peeled off a fingernail. "I hopped," said Ruby. The class giggled. Ruby's ears turned red. "But I did! I hopped around the picnic table 10 times. Ruby looked around the room. Watch. Ruby sprang from her desk. She hopped forward. She hopped backward. She hopped sideways with both eyes shut. The class cheered and clapped their hands to the beat of Ruby's feet. Ruby was the best hopper they had ever seen. Miss Hart turned on the tape player and said, "Follow the leader. Do the Ruby hop." So Ruby led the class around her room while everyone else copied her. And at noon, Ruby and Angela hopped home for lunch. The end. So, what are some things that we can take away from this book? What are some things that we learned? I learned that this book shows everyone is special in their own ways, and it's important to be yourself before you be anything else. And one of my favorite lines from this book was when Miss Hart actually said to Ruby that you don't need to copy everything Angela does. You can be anything you want to be, but be Ruby first. I like Ruby because that kind of shows the readers that it's important to do your own thing and not just copy what someone else does because you think that's the cool thing to do. So some questions that I want to ask to leave you guys off with are, what do you think Ruby could have done instead of copying Angela this whole time? And how do you think Angela felt with Ruby copying her all the time? And what are some clues that told us how Angela felt during the book when she saw Ruby copying her all the time? And then the last question I want to ask is, how do you think you would feel if you were in Angela's shoes and you had someone copying everything you did?